On September 29, 2025, Madagascar's President Andry Rajoelina comes on TV and does the unthinkable. He announces he's dissolving his entire government. The Prime Minister, all the ministers, gone, just like that. This wasn't a political shovel. This was a total collapse, and it was triggered by days of furious protest led by the country's youth over something you and I take for granted: power and water. The numbers are grim. The United Nations is reporting that at least 22 people have been killed in the chaos. They are saying security forces used excessive force, even life rounds, on protesters who were for the most part peaceful. The president actually got on air, apologized for the failures, and promised a new cabinet in days. Get this, he even suggested he will be recruiting through email and LinkedIn, trying to signal he wants fresh blood. In just 10 days, Madagascar's young people brought an entire government to its knees with little more than hanging flags and their smartphones. Picture this. You are a student in the capital, Antananarivo. You are trying to study for your finals, but the lights are out for 14 hours a day. There's no running water, and the government keeps making promises it never keeps. Now, imagine you are Gen Z, you were born online, you are connected to the world, and you are absolutely done with being told to just accept the failures your parents' generation had to deal with. That's the spark behind the Leodele State movement. It literally means fed up with load shedding. But this was way more than a protest about power grid. This was a textbook case of modern revolution. They were borrowing tactics straight from Kenya's recent tax protest and using symbols from anti-government demos in Nepal. And the most striking thing, they were waving the pirate flag from the Hanem One Piece, same symbol of rebellion we've seen pop up in youth uprisings from Indonesia to France. What started online just exploded. Protests erupted in 9 cities. The government response was fast and brutal. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and then live ammunition. The UN says at least 22 people are dead. Madagascar's government, of course, is disputing those numbers. So now you've got a battle over the truth that just as heated as the protests themselves. But here's the thing you need to understand. Madagascar isn't just some island having political problems. It controls one of the most strategic shipping lanes in the world. It's at the center of a tug of war for influence between China, France, and the United States. What happens here sends ripples across the Indian Ocean. In this episode, we are going deep. How Madagascar's youth turned a power outage into a political earthquake. How a digital revolution sparked chaos in the street. And why this Gen Z uprising matter for the future of Africa. Let's get into it. What if I told you that 14 hours of darkness a day could bring down a government? In Madagascar, that's not a hypothetical question. It's exactly what just happened. And it all started with a generation that just refused to live in the shadows. Every single morning in Antananarivo, the capital, millions wake up to a reality that would break most of us. The lights don't work. The water isn't running. Hospitals are literally operating by candlelight. Students are hunched over their phones, using that little bit of light to study for university exams. Small businesses are shuttered because who can afford a generator? This isn't some temporary crisis. This is just life for over 30 million people. And the tragic irony is, the island is rich in natural resources. It's just been broken by decades of terrible management. At the very center of this mess is a company called Jirama, the National Water and Electricity Utility Company. Jirama has become the poster child for everything wrong with the country's leadership. The company is drowning in $400 million of debt. It loses about 22% of the electricity it generates just because of a faulty grid. It's bleeding $250 million a year, and for all that, it only provides power to about 36% of the population. And even for those lucky few, the power is out for up to 14 hours a day. The human cost is also devastating. Businesses say they lose 26% of their annual sales just because of power cuts. That's more than 3 times the average across sub-Saharan Africa. Hospitals can't keep patients alive. The government big flagship project, a cable car in the capital, only runs 3 hours a day. It's become this giant visible symbol of failure hanging over the city. For young people in Madagascar who grew up online, watching their friends in other countries build lives while they were studying by candlelight, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a humiliation. The phrase "Leo de la Stage" started spreading like wildfire on social media. They were fed up with the blackouts, fed up with the excuses, and fed up with being told this was normal. But this generation grew up connected to something their government never really got, a global network of resistance, and they were about to use it in a way that would shock the world. So the government controlled the electricity, but they made one huge mistake. They forgot that the internet still works on a phone. In the middle of September 2025, something incredible started to happen online in Madagascar. Young activists, a lot of them living abroad in the diaspora, started organizing what they call the Gen Z Madagascar movement. They used Facebook as their main command center, linking up frustrated kids all over across the island and beyond. They built a digital uprising that didn't need physical borders. And look, these were not amateurs. These digital natives had been watching and learning. They saw how Gen Z activists in Kenya had just forced their government to back down on a hugely unpopular tax bill. They studied the protests in Nepal, where young people carrying anime flags had literally toppled an entire government. They looked at Indonesia, where similar tactics has challenged powerful entrenched system. The most powerful symbol they adopted was that one-piece anime flag. You know the one, the greeting skull with the straw hat. It's become this unofficial emblem for youth resistance all over the world, and it wasn't random, because that flag, which represents a crew of pirates fighting a corrupt world government, has shown up in protests in Nepal, Indonesia, the Philippines, France, all at the same time. For kids in Madagascar, it was the perfect symbol for their fight, using pop culture to take on a powerful structure their parents just accepted. Their digital game was incredibly sophisticated. Hashtags went viral. The diaspora was amplifying voices on the ground for an international audience. So when they thought the government was monitoring them, they switched to encrypted messaging apps. They were sharing tactical guides, legal advice, safety tips, all borrowed from protest movements on other continents. The government, they completely underestimated it. They saw kids posting memes and just blew it off. They figured, we control the TV stations, we are fine. But they couldn't control a generation that grew up getting their information from the internet, not from the state. By September 5th, this virtual uprising was ready to hit the streets. The only question was, would they have the courage to take their revolution from their screens to the streets? September 25th, 2025, it happened. Thousands of young Madagascans poured into the streets. They were carrying those pirate flags. They were demanding something their parents' generation never really dared to ask for: accountability. The scenes in the capital that morning, they were unlike anything the country has seen in more than a decade. The government banned all demonstrations, but that didn't stop them. Thousands, mostly young people, gathered at the University of Antananarivo. Their banners said it all. Water and electricity are basic human rights. Malagasy people, wake up. We want to live, not just to survive. The visual was just stunning. You had the traditional Malagasy flags right next to those one-piece banners. Some of them had been adapted with local symbols, but everyone knew what they stood for. Protesters were wearing straw hats, just like the anime's main character, while they chanted slogans that tied their local problems to a global fight for justice. You could see the generation gap right there in the street. These weren't the cautious, polite protests of the past. These kids learned a different history. They saw what their peers in Kenya just did, forced their government to change course. They saw how kids in Nepal brought down an entire government with the same symbol and tactics. They understood that in today's world, you can get results if you just don't back down. Their messaging was smart. They weren't just complaining about infrastructure. They framed it as a human rights violation. They connected their crisis to what was happening with youths all over the world who were rising up against failing governments. At first, the government officials dismissed it all. They said it was a minor disturbance, that it would fizzle out. They just didn't get it. They didn't understand this generation had different tools and a totally different mindset. As the day went on, the protests spread from the capital to 8 other cities. The movement was going national. It was coordinated and it was getting more and more confident. But the government response would prove that President Rajoelina had learned absolutely nothing from what has been happening across Africa and beyond. Because within hours, these peaceful protesters would face a level of violence that would put the country on the UN's radar. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and then live ammunition. The moment Madagascar's government opened fire on its own citizens, they guaranteed this crisis would go global. What started as peaceful marches on September 25th turned into something much, much darker the very next day. Because the security forces, who seemed completely unprepared for how big and determined this movement was, just kept escalating the violence. International observers were stunned. First, they used tear gas. The crowds didn't budge. Then came the rubber bullet. Still, they held their ground. But by September 26th, reports were confirmed. Security forces were using live ammunition on demonstrators. Hospital sources said at least 5 people were killed in that first wave of violence, and the numbers just kept climbing as the clashes got worse in cities all over the country. The United Nations High Commission for Human Rights said he was shocked by what he called the violent responses by security forces. The official UN report came out, at least 22 dead and over 100 injured, with most of the casualties blamed on police using way too much force. Of course, the government in Madagascar immediately denied it. Officials claimed the UN was just listening to rumors or misinformation. This fight over the body count became part of a bigger war over the narrative itself. It shows you how central information has become in this modern conflict. The violence wasn't just coming from the police. There were reports of looting, supermarkets, electronic stores, banks. The protest organizers insisted this wasn't them. They said the government hired thugs to cause chaos and discredit their movement. Several of those new cable car stations were set on fire. Homes of pro-government politicians were attacked. It was clear the unrest was starting to spiral beyond just the peaceful protest. The government imposed dusk-to-dawn curfews on multiple cities. That was them admitting they were losing control. The contrast was stark. You had the protesters with their sophisticated digital organizing and the government with its crude violent response. It just highlighted the massive generational gap at the heart of the crisis. As images of the violence spread like wildfire on social media, amplified by the diaspora and human rights groups, international pressure started to build. The government's heavy hand was turning a local problem into a full-blown international crisis. With bodies piling up and the world watching, President Rajoelina had a choice: reform or fall. His first move would show everyone just out of touch his government really was. Now, look, when a president starts firing his own ministers in the middle of a crisis, you know the regime is in free fall. But Rajoelina's desperate moves just ended up proving the protesters' point. The entire system was rotten. On September 27th, facing a rising death toll and global condemnation, the president tried to make his first concession. He fired his energy minister. Rajoelina was actually in New York for UN General Assembly when he did this, and he basically said his minister was not doing his job. It was a classic attempt to find a scapegoat and shift blame for a systematic failure onto one guy. Nobody bought it, of course. The protesters saw it for what it was. the old authoritarian playbook. You sacrifice a subordinate to protect the system. This energy crisis wasn't because of one incompetent minister. It was the result of decades of corruption, mismanagement, and failure that went all the way to the top. Meanwhile, the pressure kept coming. The African Union finally spoke and called for restraint and dialogue. The Southern African Development Community, which Madagascar was actually chairing at the time, was in a really awkward spot. How do you deal with your own member state falling apart? What was probably more concerning for Rajoelina was how the big powers and global international organizations were reacting. They were starting to realize that instability in Madagascar could threaten the whole region. China, which has been pushing its Belt and Road Initiative on the island, got nervous. Their investments were at risk. France, the old colonial power and biggest trading partner, saw its strategic interests threatened. And the United States, which is competing with China for influence in the Indian Ocean, was watching very closely. But maybe the biggest problem for the president was happening inside his own government. There were reports that some officials secretly agreed with the protesters. Others were questioning if the violent crackdown was a smart move. And the military, which had backed Rajoelina since his 2009 revolution, was publicly silent. And that's never a good sign. So firing the energy minister bought Rajoelina zero time. The protests just continued in 9 cities. The demonstrators were now feeling empowered. They saw they could force the government hand. They had tasted blood and they wanted more than just one minister's head. They wanted the whole system to come crashing down. And they were about to get their wish in the most dramatic way possible. September 29, 2025, in a televised address that just stunned the entire nation, President Rajoelina did something no one saw coming. He fired his entire government and practically begged for forgiveness. The whole scene was just surreal, even for a country like Madagascar that's seen its fair share of political drama. Rajoelina went on state TV and he basically admitted his entire government had failed. He said, "We recognize and apologize if members of the government have not carried out the task assigned to them." This was a man who had clearly run out of moves. He went further than anyone expected. I understand the anger, the sadness, and the difficulties caused by the power cuts and water supply problems. I heard all the call. I felt the suffering. I understand the impact on daily life. I mean, these are words you would never have imagined hearing from Madagascar's leadership just a few weeks ago. The announcement itself was both dramatic and just plain weird. He didn't just fire the prime minister. He fired the entire cabinet. And then he announced that the government would be accepting applications for new positions through email and LinkedIn. It was this bizarre attempt to look modern and open in the face of a crisis that was fueled by the digital age. But here's the catch. He never once addressed the cause for his own resignation. The protesters were demanding that he and his government go. Rajoelina made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. He was trying to position himself as the solution, not the problem. The world reacted with a mix of cautious hope and a lot of skepticism. Some saw it as proof that if you keep up the pressure, you can force even authoritarian leaders to listen. Others pointed out that Madagascar has shuffled its government like this before, and it never fixed the real deep-rooted problems. The implications for the rest of Africa were huge. Other leaders on the continent who are dealing with their own restless youth movement were watching nervously. Madagascar just became the prime example of how quickly organized, digitally savvy young people can challenge a powerful, entrenched government. These protests are a stress test for democracy all across a continent where you have aging leaders facing off against a young, educated, and connected population. But here's the thing about revolutions. They rarely stop where you think they will. And this story has consequences that go beyond Madagascar's borders. It goes right to the heart of global geopolitics. Madagascar might seem like a small island, but look at the map. It sits right on top of one of the world's most important shipping lanes. What happens there sends shockwaves across 3 continents. That waterway between Madagascar and mainland Africa is called the Mozambique Channel. It's a critical choke point for global trade. All of the oil tankers, the container ships, the naval fleet that can use riskier routes like the Strait of Hormuz, they all depend on that channel. So if Madagascar is unstable, it directly impacts shipping costs, energy supplies, and military strategy for every major power in the Indian Ocean. China's reaction tells you everything you need to know about its ambitions. Chinese companies have been positioning massive projects there, like a deep water port in Narendra that could be used for both commercial and military ships. This chaos threatens this investment, but it also might create an opening for China's rivals. Beijing's whole Belt and Road initiative depends on stability. So what's happening in Madagascar is a direct challenge to their strategy. France, the former colonial power, has its own problems. President Macron had just visited in April 2025, the first French president to do so in 20 years. He was there to lock down access to strategic rare earth minerals and to deepen economic ties. This uprising threatens all of that, and it shows that the old post-colonial way of doing things just doesn't work anymore. And then there's the United States, which is in a constant competition for influence in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar's location makes it a key piece on the chessboard. Instability there affects the strategic calculations happening in Washington, Beijing, and all across Europe. But this revolution is about something bigger than just geopolitics. It's an example of how modern youth movement doesn't care about borders. They use the same symbols, the same tactics, and the same digital tools to challenge power structures their parents just had to accept. That one-piece flag showing up in Nepal, Indonesia, and Madagascar at the same time shows you how global pop culture has become the new language of political resistance. This is part of a broader pattern we are seeing across Africa. From Kenya's tax protests to this infrastructure revolt in Madagascar, young, connected, and educated populations are just not going to put up with the failures their parents had to endure. Climate change, economic problems, corruption, all of it is creating a perfect storm where old school authority is facing an unprecedented challenge from kids who are empowered by technology. What happens in Madagascar is a warning shot to leaders all across the developing world, especially Africa. In an age of social media and global connection, no government can afford to ignore its people forever. The question for other African leaders is simple. Are you going to learn from Madagascar's example and actually perform? Or are you going to wait for your own light to go out? Madagascar's youth proved that in the age of social media and global connectivity, no government, no matter how remote, can ignore its people's demands forever. The question now is, which African leader will be next to learn this lesson? And will they learn it before their own lights go out? Now, if you have watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa, where we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view, where we talk about the kind of issues with the kind of details that mainstream media does everything to avoid. Now, if you are in Madagascar or in any country that have grievances, of course, almost every country in Africa have their different kind of grievances. But if you are in Madagascar especially, do us a favor and go to the comment section and tell us exactly what is happening on ground right now. What is the solution to this revolution? Is your president going to resign? Is he going to keep selling himself as the solution to the same problem he himself caused? This guy used to be a revolutionary back in 2009, and the people of Madagascar supported him to become the president because of his revolutionary antics. But now, he has become the establishment himself. This is the cause of almost every revolution in Africa. They always start good. They always start on the side of the people. But then when they become the establishment, they become the problems themselves. So go to the comment section and tell us your opinion on all of these matters. And if you want to see more of my videos, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.